Hey nerdy knitters, welcome to the very first episode of Knitting 411, the video podcast that's all about your knitting questions. I'm Tanya, a certified knitting teacher and a knitwear designer, and the goal of this new show is to help you become a more confident knitter and to create a community of knitters who are interested in exploring and developing their craft. Since it's the first episode, I thought we'd just go over what's going to happen and the schedule, which right now will be pre-recorded every other Wednesday at 11 a.m. New videos will be released, but I want this to be a really helpful show that answers your knitting questions. So if you have any ideas or things that you'd like to see included, please leave a comment and tell me about them. Each episode will be roughly divided into 3 parts. The first part will be sort of a mini knitting podcast where I talk about what I'm working on, helpful resources, and things like that. The second part of the show is really the meat and potatoes of this program, where I answer your knitting questions. So you need to ask some questions. To keep things organized, I'd like to limit that to 2 places. You can leave your questions right down in the comments below this video. I check them all the time, so any new questions you have, I'll be sure to grab a screenshot of them and answer them in upcoming videos. You can also go to the community tab of the Nerdy Knitting YouTube page. One way to access this is go to the Nerdy Knitting YouTube page, either in your phone or your tablet or on your computer. And if you look across the top, you'll see the different sections. If you click on the one that says community, you'll see different comments and things posted there. Scroll down to the most recent Knitting 411 question. I'll post one every week. It'll have a big picture on it, so you'll be able to see exactly where it is. And underneath that is a little comments icon. You can click on that and you can leave your questions right there. The second way to see this community section is if you're already subscribed and you're on your mobile device. Scrolling through your subscriptions, you'll see not just videos that of people you're subscribed to, but any comments or things they've posted in their community tabs. So you'll see that show up in your feed as well. So I need your help to make this a successful show. I need to know what your questions about knitting are. So you can post them down in the comments or go to that community tab and look for the most recent picture for Knitting 411 and ask your question right there. And I will try to answer them in upcoming episodes. Now those are the 2 major sections for each video, but we'll wrap up each week with a little housekeeping section. Any comments or questions for the future or anything we might decide to work on together, any knit-alongs or giveaways, things like that. We'll finish off the show with all of the announcements and details like that. So please leave me some questions for the next episode and I'll do my best to answer them. There, now you know what's going to happen in every episode. Let's just jump right in with our opening chat and talk about what I'm working on. The big project I'm currently working on is level 3 of the Master Hand Knitting program from the Knitting Guild Association. That was what was on my Christmas list, so that's what I got for Christmas. So that shows you how nerdy I am about my knitting when you want something like that for Christmas. And like the other levels, it's broken up into different sections. I have a whole video about that. I'll link it down below. But there's swatches to work on and projects and writing assignments. So lots to do. And it'll probably take me a whole year to complete it, at least. So most of the major writing part is out of the way. I still have questions to answer and things like that. But for long reports and reviews, I think I have 2 magazine reviews left to do. But everything else is finished. And I've started working on the swatches, and I'm sort of jumping around right now. The first section is about cast-ons and bind-offs and increases and decreases, and I'm waiting for a book about cast-ons and bind-offs before I cover all of those. So I'm jumping around and doing a few different ones. I've done the very first swatch, which is a tubular cast-on and bind-off. So I'll have a video all about that coming up. Since I've been doing so much research, I thought I'd combine the 2 and make videos of the things that I find really interesting. And then I've done some of the fancy stitch pattern swatches. There was a herringbone swatch, so I've been working on that this week. And entrelac. I've tried that before, and this one I had to knit a few times, and I think this will be the final one I submit. If you want to try entrelac, I suggest that you learn to knit backwards. I'm so glad I learned that last year because it made such a difference. There's so much happening. You're turning your work constantly with this method. So instead of having to do that, if you learn to knit backwards, you never have to turn things around. You can always work from the front of the work and just move back and forth, and it makes it so much easier. So those 3 swatches are all bagged and tagged, and now I'm working on the double brioche, or honeycomb brioche, I think it's also called. And that one's really interesting. I'm looking at different cast-on techniques for that, and I've probably cast on 4 times and not quite satisfied with all of them. I think I finally got it figured out though. So I'll get that swatch done this week too. And then I'm going to tackle the double knitting swatch. That one I was a little intimidated by, but I've been reading about it and practicing, and it's not as hard as I thought it would be. It's actually pretty simple. You just have to pay attention to where everything is on your needles while you're working. So I'll talk about that one in the next episode. I'm also working on a new design for a scarf. I've had lots of questions about reading charts and stitch patterns and things like that. So I'm working on a pattern for a scarf that goes over some basic knit and purl texture. 4 different patterns, a 2x2 rib, box stitch, and a couple of other ones. So that video and pattern will be released probably in a month or so after the scarf is done and I can get the pattern written up. So if you're new to reading charts or reading written instructions, we're going to go over all of that. And it's just a knit and purl. That's all you're doing. But you'll get a good foundation in reading those instructions and understanding how they work. The last thing I want to talk about is knitting reference books. I'm starting to build my collection, especially while I'm working through the Master Hand Knitting program. But one I usually refer to first whenever I'm looking at something new is the Vogue Knitting book. I like images and pictures to go along with my instructions. I'm very visual, so I like to see those illustrations as I'm trying to work things out. I find that really helpful. Actually, just reading instructions and working them on the needles is good too, but I just like this one because it covers a lot of different things, like a high level overview. Nothing is super in depth. I like other books for that, but there's a lot of the basic things that every knitter should know in this book. So if you're looking for one reference book and you're a visual learner and you like a high level overview, then this is probably a good book for you too. Now it's time for our knitting questions and answers. I've looked through some of my recent comments on different YouTube videos and I grabbed a few that I thought would be interesting to talk about. So the first question was, how do you close a hole that a yarn over makes? Sometimes you like that decorative hole. Sometimes you just want to use a quick yarn over but then close it up so you don't have that hole later on. And of course, the simplest solution is to knit it through the back leg. That closes it up, but it also makes it lean off to the left. So what if you're using 2 yarn overs, one at the end and one at the beginning of a row, and you want them to lean in different directions? There's actually a second way you can work that yarn over to close up the hole and make it lean off to the right. And of course, this works on your knit rows and your purl rows. If you're working in stockinette or whichever fabric you're making, you can do this method with both of those. So this quick clip will show you exactly how to do that. To work a normal yarn over, you knit right into the center of the stitch and you leave the little hole that it creates. But you can also close that hole. You can knit it through the back leg. Just insert into that back leg, knit it like a normal stitch. You can see it closes the hole and it sort of slants off to the left. But if you want it to slant in the other direction, all you need to do is slip it to your right needle and slip it back to your left needle. And now in this position, you can see if you knit it through that back leg, it's going to leave it wide open. So you knit through the front leg. And you can see it closes the hole and it twists off to the right. Now if you work those yarn overs on a right side row and you need to purl them on the wrong side, to purl a regular yarn over, you just purl it like a normal stitch and it leaves it wide open, but you can close it on a purl row too. Now to close a yarn over on a purl row, you need to insert through the back leg, just like this, and purl it closed. And you can't really see which way it leans on this side, but if you turned it around, you could see purling it closed leans off to the left. But you can also make this one lean off to the right as well. So slip it over to your right needle, and in this new stitch mount, slip it back. And now you can see if we purl it through that back leg now, it's going to leave it wide open. So we purl it through the front leg. And like the other one, it doesn't really have a lean on this side, but if you flip it over and look, you can see it leans off to the right. The next question we had was, how is self-striping yarn different from variegated yarn? And really, it's a simple answer, but I went into a little more depth than she probably wanted. But it really comes down to the length of the color repeats. With self-striping yarn, they are very exact, measured out, so you get those exact stripes. Variegated yarn can vary from really short color repeats to very long color repeats and everything in between. You can watch this little clip and find out more about that. The length of the color variations in a variegated yarn will affect the way it's knit up. For example, in this sock yarn, you can see each of the color changes. That one's about 5 inches. That one's about 6. That one's about 6. This one. So they're all about 5 or 6 inches, each of the color repeats in this yarn. So that one's fairly fast moving. Then we have this yarn, a cotton dishcloth yarn, and the repeats in this one is more than 12 inches long. Oof, more than 12 inches, much more. More than 12 inches. So this one has a very long repeats. This one has fairly short repeats. You can be broken into about 3 different categories. Really short repeats of about 4 inches, and then from 4 to 7 or 8 inches like this one here, and then ones that are longer than 8 inches like this one here. And those will knit up in different ways depending on how long the repeats are and also what you're knitting. For this one, I knit a sock. So it's a small tube, and you can see it still gives us some color pooling because it's such a small tube. So we still get sort of a stripy effect. If we had knit this flat and a wide object, it wouldn't be so much color pooling as just lots of variegated color, but because it's knit in the round and it's smaller in circumference, we get still a bit of color pooling. With something like this dishcloth yarn with really long color repeats, this shows you really get more pronounced color pooling with this. So you can see how it color pools differently than this sock yarn, which sort of has a stripy effect. So there are 2 things that affect how a variegated yarn will knit up: the length of the color repeats in the yarn itself, and then the object that you are knitting. So short repeats, but still a small object, you get some color pooling. Long repeat and you get color pooling. The longer the color changes, the more likely you are to get pooling. Now, how is this kind of yarn different from self-striping yarn? This is a self-striping yarn, and you can see the color repeats in this are very, very long, that whole big section of red. Even holding it like that, you can see it's going to knit up, especially where it's a small tube, into stripes. So each of those color changes are set at particular intervals. This one has small stripes interspersed with larger stripes. So each of those are particular lengths. It's not varied as much as you'd see in something like a variegated yarn. And when I knit this up, you can see it produces stripes. So the only difference between variegated yarn and self-striping is the length of the color repeats and how varied they are. In a variegated yarn, they're going to be more varied. In a self-striping, they are pretty exact, so you can get those stripes in your socks. Now, this next question sort of goes along with that one about variegated yarn. I had somebody ask how you could tell, like she had a specific yarn in mind, the Viking yarn Naturagarn 627. The sample on the website showed that yarn knit up in like a slipper sock, but she was planning to knit a scarf, so she was curious to know if there was a difference. Would it look different knit up as a scarf than it would as a slipper? And I told her it probably would, because one is knit flat, one is knit in the round, the different width of the material. There's lots of things that can impact it, but there's one thing she could do to get a good idea of how it would look. If you go to Ravelry, do a search for the specific yarn and the color, and then click on the Projects tab, and you can scroll through and see the projects that other people have done. And if there's a specific, you might not find the same exact pattern, but if it's a specific type of garment, like a scarf, then you can look at the other scarves that have been knit and get a pretty good idea of how that yarn is going to look when it's knit up, especially when it's a variegated yarn and you're not sure how the color translates from skein to knitting. Depending on the project, it can look quite different. But going to Ravelry, looking for that specific yarn and color, and then clicking on the Projects tab and scrolling through, that'll give you a good idea of how that yarn is going to work up into your final knitted garment. I've been doing a series on triangle shawls recently and all of the different ways to knit them. And in one of those videos, somebody left a comment asking how she could turn the birds of a feather shawl into a smaller shawlette. And this can apply to any kind of shawl that uses that same construction. It's called a kite shawl or a sideways or a bias shawl. There's lots of different names, but as long as it has this construction, there's one way you can adjust the size of it. If you don't want the long wingspan of the shawl, you want something more like a shawlette. You'll learn how to do that in this little video. These shawls all start the same. You work increases along both edges and a decrease along the center on the right side. And then on the wrong side rows, you're working increases. So the right side rows kind of cancel each other out. That central decrease is a double decrease, so it cancels out the increases, but then you've got the increases worked on the wrong side rows, which creates this shape, and it sort of has this bias effect to it. So when the pattern will tell you to work to a certain stitch count, and then you switch to the second half of the shawl. And on the second half of the shawl, you're working the right side rows just the same, but on the wrong side rows, you're dropping the increase that's worked over here, but still working it on this side. So all of those stitches slowly shift to this side until this is way over on the edge. I didn't work quite that long. I just finished it early. But that's the basic shape of the shawl. So a pattern like Birds of a Feather will tell you how long to work this point and what the stitch count should be. If you want to change that at all, if you want to make, like the example, the question that was asked, is she didn't like the big full-size shawl and she wanted more of a shawlette since she lives in a warmer climate. So all she would need to do is to change the stitch count. She would just work this first half of the pattern until it was about half the width that she wanted. Then at that point, no matter what her stitch count is, she would switch to the second half of the pattern, dropping that increase on one edge but working it on the other, and that gives you about the other half of the shawl from that point on. So you can change any pattern if it's Birds of a Feather or another pattern that uses this kite shawl method. You would just follow that rule. Don't work to the stitch count they tell you, but just change the stitch count. If you want it longer, if you want it shorter, you just work the first half to about half the length you want, and then you switch to the second half of the pattern and work that. Now we have one more knitting question to answer, but before we do that, I just want to ask for your help. To make this a successful show for all knitters, I need you to ask your knitting questions. So be sure to leave them down below in the comments or head over to the Nerdy Knitting YouTube page, click on the community tab, look for the most recent post for Wednesday's upcoming episode, and leave your comments and questions there as well. The last question I want to answer every week is what we're going to call our community question. I'm going to pin a comment down below with this question, and I want your help to answer it. This week's question is from Philip. He wants to know about different sock heels and when to use them. He hears about lots of different types, short row, peasant heel, flegels, all of those. But I want your help answering this question. Do you use the same sock heel all the time? And if so, which one is your favorite? Or do you use different sock heels depending on who you're knitting for? Like, I like to wear a short row heel, but for my husband, it fits better if I do a heel flap and gusset. So I knit different heels depending on who I knit for. So I need your help answering this question. Just scroll down, look for the pinned comment that's underneath this video, and help answer Philip's question about sock heels. And every week we'll have a different community question. If there's something I think would be best answered by lots of different opinions and different knitters, then that's where it's going to go. So please share your advice and opinions. And next week, when we open with our questions and answers, I'll start by looking at the answers that you gave to his question. I hope you enjoyed this first episode. Please leave your questions for me to answer in upcoming videos down in the comments or over on that post in the community tab. And if you love to knit sock heels and you have some advice and thoughts about that for Philip, be sure to leave a comment in the pinned comments. And be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.